Howdy, welcome back. Today, I'm making a very exciting video for me. I want to talk about my two favorite authors. I have mentioned them in every single video I've recorded on the channel thus far, so I figured it would be probably a good idea to make my first video showcasing just them. And there'll probably be a lot more videos showcasing just them to come. So, if you are new here, or if you pay attention to me, at least insofar as you recognize patterns, my two favorite authors are right here, Cormac McCarthy and Fyodor Dostoevsky. Right, let's talk about them. So how I discovered McCarthy is what set me on like my current reading journey. And that is actually through YouTube. So YouTube has a lot of like free audiobooks on the platform. At some point last year, I listened to Jaws audiobook, and one of the recommendations was No Country for Old Men. And I listened to that, and it really took me away because it was like, man, this is really much like the movie, but then also the narrator of that story, I don't know who it is, I'll put him up right here, does a phenomenal job of narrating the flow and voice of McCarthy. That's how I discovered him initially, and then after I listened to No Country for Old Men, I was like, man, I should like use this opportunity to get into reading, and I went and I picked up the road, and we'll get into that. It forever changed what I do in my free time. Now, Dostoevsky, on the other hand, there's probably a couple ways that I found out about him. I used to listen to a lot of Jordan Peterson a long time ago, and it was a name that was kind of thrown around, but never really like made the impression like I should go read this guy. But then there was also a TikTok I saw like 3 or 4 years ago where someone was describing Crime and Punishment. Ultimately, what caused me to go buy Crime and Punishment was after I had been reading for a couple months at that point. There's a song by La Dispute called King Park, and in that song, it documents this true story of a shootout that happened in Grand Rapids, actually, and just the emotional toll that it took on the person who killed someone they didn't intend to kill. And I was like, that, like hearing that song instantly reminded me of like, that sounds like the premise for Crime and Punishment. So I went out and I got it, and I read it feverishly. I flew through the book, which is kind of unfortunate because I wish I would have taken my time with it. But it's all right. It's future rereading. And I came to find out that there was so much more to the story and to the writing that than what I had just, assumed. And so from there, as you probably know, if you've watched my top 5 books, I just read a lot of their literature throughout last year. I spent so much time with these two authors, and even now, as I am reading this year, I'm trying to hold off on approaching these two authors. But I think what ultimately inspired me to do this video is I picked up this book right here, started reading White Nights, and instantly was taken back to the joy I had while reading Dostoevsky. So I'm going to break up this video into kind of 2 parts and talk about each respective author individually. Despite the fact that these authors, Cormac was a huge fan of Dostoevsky, but also their themes are pretty similar to each other, yet they are like drastically different. I just kind of want to highlight what I appreciate about both of these authors. One of the things I think I appreciate the most about Dostoevsky is the directness in which he writes his novels. He's very to the point about things, and he's very, very like tell you how it is. And there's an argument that showing and not telling is kind of like better for storytelling and writing in general. However, you have to take into account that Dostoevsky often was writing against the clock. He was a man who constantly found himself in debt and had little to no time to edit his works. But despite that, it is just such a testament to how creative and good some people are, where Dostoevsky couldn't really touch a whole lot of the stuff that he wrote about, and it still is revered over 100 years now, I think, from when he wrote most of these novels. And that is just such a testament to the man himself. And you might be thinking, like, why would I ever want to read books that are that old? And well, Dostoevsky's stories and topics and the things he discusses in these books are so relevant to today. You have talks of political ideology, religious ideology, atheism, relationships, and all these things. You would be so surprised how just relevant and applicable they are to modern day life. And a lot of the warnings Dostoevsky gives are also very much still relevant. If you are familiar with Dostoevsky, Demons is a book, or Devils, or The Possessed, as some people translate it, is a very clear-cut warning against ideology and how far it can take people down these paths of just kind of, I don't want to say like degenerate behavior, but just like evilness, like it can lead people to evilness. And it's just a showcase of how you can be sucked into these things and how you can get out of them. Crime and Punishment is another really good example. Raskolnikov has this idea that he is supposed to be larger than everyone else around him. And so it drives him to commit this murder. And I don't want to get too heavy into spoilers, but in Crime and Punishment, the murder happens within the first 100 pages roughly of, at least this copy I think is just short of, or it's just over 600, just short of it's like about a little over 650 pages. And that in itself is just talking about like the rationalization of our thoughts and these ideas and taking them to their absolute extreme limit. And it's a warning against that kind of stuff. And I guess that kind of leads into my next point too. And that is that Dostoevsky writes both sides of the aisle so well. He has a couple shortcomings in the things he talks about and how he represents them from what I've read online. But to have an author that can argue both sides of the aisle with conviction against and for his beliefs, it is just so refreshing, because it's not like that the term straw manning. He's not doing any of that. He is laying out very clear cases and very understandable cases for the way some of these people think. One instance that comes to mind is Ippolit in The Idiot. He is a 18-year-old radical socialist who is suffering from consumption, and he writes this big dramatic thing explaining kind of his life story and what led him to believe the things he does. And it's like, yeah, I would see, why someone would fall into the position he did, Even in the Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky, despite being a Russian Orthodox Christian, lays out a phenomenal argument for atheism and the idea that God is not inherently good, based on what happens in the world around us. And those are chapters that are still mulled over today. You can even buy Rebellion and the Grand Inquisitor as a standalone. That's how impactful these things are. To keep going along the theme of his characters, reading Dostoevsky a lot of times is kind of like looking into a mirror. There's a character within any of these books that you will see yourself in. If you've read Brothers Karamazov and are familiar with the character of Dmitri, unfortunately I saw a lot of myself in him, because he's very passionate, very eclectic, very hot-headed. And I went into that book hoping I would be more like Alyosha. I think everyone kind of thinks that. And as you read, you start to see yourself in the positions of these characters. And that might not always be a good thing. I think it might confront you. Like reading Brothers and realizing how similar I am in my personality to Dmitri, despite I don't hate my father. Seeing that was kind of uncomfortable for me, and it made me start thinking. And it's like, wow, I really should probably take a step back sometimes, really process things, and not just be so emotionally invested in every single moment, and kind of let myself work through things before responding. And I mean, you could make a whole entire video for how he lays out his characters. Raskolnikov is a poor man living in a poor section of St. Petersburg who, despite all of this stuff, still acts in very selfless ways, but wants to be kind of a little more selfish. Krylov in Devils kind of has this really nihilistic approach to his own life and the world around him. And then you have Shatov, who is someone who is really struggling with the choices he's made and is figuring out that it's not at all what he thought it would be, and is trying to move on from his mistakes in his past. And unfortunately, for a lot of these characters, life does not really, it's not fair to them. It's not how you'd want it to turn out for some of them. In some cases, it is. Raskolnikov, I won't get into that. But Raskolnikov, eventually comes around and finds redemption for himself, and it's great. But that is not always the case, and I think that is just such a real look at life. And I guess last but not least, just to kind of wrap this up, is that his books are incredibly engaging, despite the fact that a lot of the time it is very much like characters moving from one location to another and having a conversation, and then some of those characters go to a different location and have a different conversation. But almost every conversation that he writes in these books is something that really draws consideration from the reader. It takes a lot of thought and a lot of pondering about what's being said. It's very, very intentional. And I think it's really good. I think last but not least, Dostoevsky is the perfect author for any reader, because you can get so much out of the story as a casual reader, but there's also so much depth to his works that if you are interested in diving further into individual works, you can look up the history, you can look up the references, all these different things. And a lot of these books have notes at the back where they're kind of tell you oh, he had this idea from here, or he drew inspiration from here. And even some of the other themes, they just go deeper than the surface, and it's great. I just have really enjoyed my time reading Dostoevsky. Out of the two I'm showcasing today, I would say he's probably number one, but as all feelings are, they are subject to change. Sometimes it's Cormac, sometimes it's Dostoevsky, but they're always fighting for the top spot on my list. And truthfully, it's a little upsetting that I started my reading journey with two phenomenal authors like these, because it makes enjoying other books kind of difficult sometimes. Especially when, it's just, these authors just really stand out to me. Okay. Thank you, Dostoevsky. If you've not read Dostoevsky, I'm going to say start with Crime and Punishment. It's probably your best bet. That's his most action-full story. It's very fast-paced. It's very fluid. I don't expect all his books to be like that. However, that does not mean that they are boring. Sometimes they are just slow. That's okay. Take your time with everything you read from Dostoevsky. Now, on to Cormac McCarthy. Cormac McCarthy is such a special author and such a great reading experience, where he was a man who took sometimes 15, 20 years to perfect his books. And you really get that. There's not a sentence, there is not a word that is out of place or feels like it's just thrown into these books. Everything feels so incredibly precise, and man, it's just so good. Cormac really showed me how you can blend poetry with the art of storytelling without it being a poem. These books aren't like the Iliad, where it's written in verse, but there is still such a profound flow and voice, and it's very lyrical in the way that he writes. And it was the first time I'd ever experienced anything like that. And I think a big part of the appreciation is that it's very bold. Sometimes Cormac has sentences that run on 50 or 60 words, and it rides the line of is this phenomenal or is this too much? And I think it's a very delicate balance that he takes in his writing that is very, like I said, it's very bold and it's very beautiful, and it pays off. McCarthy's prose, or the prose, I am honestly not 100% sure how I use prose in a sentence, but McCarthy's prose are somewhat otherworldly. The way he describes landscapes and kind of happenings, it's very very mystical in a sense, and it's also very tangible. You get such a vivid picture in the theater of the mind of the things he's describing. And as someone who, I have 4 tattoos on this arm that are all from things of nature, someone who I really appreciate the earth and the world around me. It is just such a joy to read, and it brings the magic to the earth through the writing, and I think that is just so cool. I don't want to compare it to Tolkien, but that's another author who really emphasized kind of the magic within the world, and granted, Middle Earth is fake, but Tolkien, was inspired by the English countryside and the things going on there. And while McCarthy's is more rooted in our actual world, it still has that kind of like mystical, magical tendency to it. The snow in the pass was halfway to the horse's belly, and the horse trod down the drifts in high elegance and swung its smoking muzzle over the white and crystal reefs and looked out, down through the dark mountain woods, or cocked its ears at the sudden flight of small winter birds before them. There were no tracks in the pass, and there was neither cattle nor tracks of cattle in the upper pasture beyond the pass. It was very cold. A mile south of the pass, they crossed a running branch so black in the snow it caused the horse to balk, just for any slight movement of the water, to tell that it was no bottomless crevice that had split up the mountain in the night. 100 yards farther, the track of the wolf entered the trail and went down the mountain before them. They rode on into the darkness, and the moon-balanced waste lay before them cold and pale, and the moon sat in a ring overhead, and in that ring lay a mock moon with its own cold gray and nacre seas. They made camp on a low bench of land where walls of dry aggregate marked an old river course, and they struck up a fire about which they sat in silence, the eyes of the dog and of the idiot and certain other men glowing red as coals in their heads where they turned. The flames sawed in the wind, and the embers paled and deepened, like the blood beat of some living thing eviscerate upon the ground before them. And they watched the fire, which does contain within it something of men themselves, inasmuch as they are less without it, and are divided from their origins, and are exiles. For each fire is all fires, the first fire and the last ever to be. I think there are a few themes that are very much within all of his works, at least the ones I've read, that Cormac constantly talks about, and I think that is the inherent violence and cruelty within humans and nature itself. Despite how magnificent nature is, it is very unforgiving for people. He kind of is always talking about the ways of old and how everything's changing. I'm surprised it's not like a meme or a joke within McCarthy circles to talk about the fences in his works as being these representations of dividing off the wild land and stuff like that, because it's mentioned in a ton of his work. Just kind of like, restraining and limiting things for our own benefit and simultaneously destroying the natural land that is there. And ultimately, I don't have a whole lot to say about Cormac because I feel like I am not well read enough and comprehensive enough to extract as much as I want to be able to out of his works. Stories like The Crossing I read, and I knew that there was something just out of my fingertips with the work that I was trying to attain, and I couldn't yet. And I think that's what makes me so excited about him, is that the depth in his works is there's almost no end to it, especially things like Suttree and Blood Meridian. I feel like those are books you could read 200, 300 times and still figure out new things, new ways of looking at the sentence structure, at the story, at these characters, and you will be rewarded for that. And as someone who, at this point in my life, I almost want to stop buying books. As much as I am interested in other works and other authors, I am like, man, between Dostoevsky and Cormac McCarthy, I could have my hands full for the rest of my life trying to decipher and figure out and really interpret these masterpieces that both these authors wrote. And that just excites me. I am so excited to return to each and every one of these books. The Road is one I am excited to read when I become a father. Blood Meridian, as if you know the content of the book, Blood Meridian, in some sense, is kind of like a comfort book for me because of the flow and the stylizing. Not what happens, obviously, but just the way it's written, and man, I love it. I just love it. Okay, beloved, I hope I was able to do both of these authors justice. This isn't an in-depth view into their works. This is just my love and appreciation for both of them. Because of these two, I have found the joy of reading, and I just am so thankful for all the experiences and all the time I've had with them. You know, Cormac feels kind of like a teacher in some sense, and Dostoevsky feels like a friend. Feels like I'm in conversation with him, and this feels like, there's just gold within here that I am constantly going to be digging towards, and I love it. I love it so much. I'm getting a little choked up. I'm not really getting choked up. I'm just so thankful, for the gifts that God gives people, and that I get to experience that. What a blessing. So, okay, I love you. Be well. Have a good night. Have a good day. We'll see you in the next one.